Senator Mohamed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak in support of the amendment moved by the government sponsor, Senator Dean, to include a mandatory 5-year parliamentary review on Bill C-12. At the outset, I accept that the current environment demands change and that inefficiencies in our system require attention. Governments have a responsibility to respond when systems are strained. But when governments seek significant new powers or introduce substantial departures from established practices, Parliament also has a responsibility to ensure those powers are subject to meaningful scrutiny. The proposed parliamentary review is therefore an important step forward by the government that the measures in this bill warrant further examination. It suggests accountability. It reflects a basic truth about public policy. Parliament does not legislate in a vacuum. And it implies that Parliament will eventually return to examine whether the powers it has granted remain justified. In short, a review creates an opportunity for evidence. That opportunity is particularly important in the case of Bill C-12. Throughout the debate on this legislation, the government has argued that these measures are necessary to address significant abuse within Canada's asylum system. Claims of widespread fraud has been cited as justification for new enforcement tools and procedural changes contained in this bill. Despite repeated requests from senators and stakeholders, clear data demonstrating the scale of the problem has not been provided by the minister or her official, and this should give us pause. Some refugee advocates and practitioners who work directly with the asylum determination process suggest that confirmed cases of deliberate fraud appear to number in the dozens annually, not in the hundreds or thousands sometimes applied in public discourse. If that assessment is even partially accurate, then Parliament must be cautious about legislating on the basis of narrative rather than evidence. Senators, I'm not naive. This doesn't mean that fraud does not exist. No system is immune to the abuse, but it does raise a legitimate question about proportionality. Public policy should always be grounded in reliable evidence, and when that evidence is incomplete or contested, Parliament has a responsibility to build mechanisms into legislation that allows its impact to be studied and assessed over time, and if necessary, changed. That is the promise of a parliamentary review. However, experience tells us that review clauses often appear far more robust on paper than they prove to be in practice. In reality, reviews frequently become procedural formalities, delayed, diluted, or quietly ignored. Scholars studying post-legislative scrutiny have consistently found that reviews lacking meaningful consequences tend to be weak and effective. And I'm pleased, Senator Dean, to see that in your latest iteration of your amendment, you address some of the shortcomings of just having a review without time to ministerial responsibility and report during a certain period of time with the obligation to report on the findings. But I do want you to keep in mind that one study examining statutory review provisions in federal legislation found that over a 20-year period, Parliament inserted 51 review clauses into federal bills. Now, this is really important. Of those 51 provisions, fewer than a third, only 17, ever produced a report. In short, honourable senators, a review without consequences is oversight in name only. The amendment before us establishes a review mechanism, and it now requires Parliament to act on the information it produces. That is a welcome step. You'll notice that I had to change my speech because the amendment came in, and I'm thankful for some of those changes, Senator Dean. I want to speak a little bit about what we might consider as we think about passing this particular amendment, and that is the idea of, does it go far enough? Does a review go far enough? Do the mechanisms in this amendment go far enough? In 2001, when the Senate studied Bill C-36, the Anti-Terrorism Act, senators recognized that extraordinary powers require extraordinary accountability. The special Senate committee examining the legislation conducted review provisions alone were insufficient. To ensure meaningful oversight, the committee recommended pairing review mechanisms with sunset clauses. Yes, the S word. Provisions that would cause extraordinary powers to expire unless Parliament affirmatively decided to renew them. The reasoning was straightforward. the review gathers evidence. Some may suggest that comparing this legislation with anti-terrorism legislation is comparing apples to oranges. In fact, it's not. The Anti-Terrorism Act introduced exceptional powers in the name of public interest. That should sound familiar to people in this chamber. Today, the government is making a similar argument to justify the measures contained in Parts 5 through 8 of Bill C-12. The government of the day in 2001, a government of which I was part of as I was the Director of Communications to the Minister of Justice who was moving the bill at the time, accepted that the logic of incorporating a sunset clause into the most contentious provisions of the legislation made sense. Honourable Senators, I want to be clear about one matter. At this stage, we are debating the amendment establishing a parliamentary review and some additional measures. I intend to move a complementary amendment that would add a sunset clause. On that question, I think we must give some consideration. Without the moment of reckoning, democratic reckoning, a review risks becoming exactly what critics of post-legislative scrutiny have long warned about, a symbolic gesture that creates the appearance of accountability while leaving the underlying law untouched. Honourable Senators, Parliament can do better. This bill will pass, there is no doubt in my mind. The government will receive the authority that it seeks. If we do open our minds to a sunset clause, this will not prevent anything materially in this bill from happening. It ensures that 5 years from now, the government of the day must return to Parliament and justify whether these powers remain necessary. And it ensures that a decision will be made not in the heat of urgency, but with the benefit of evidence gathered through parliamentary review. In that sense, a sunset clause does not weaken a review process, it strengthens it, it gives its review purpose, and it gives its findings consequence. And it ensures that our Parliament ultimately decides whether these extraordinary powers contained in this bill should continue with the benefit of data collected over 5 years. This is restraint in every principled sense of the term. We've been talking a lot about restraint in this chamber. So I will support the amendment brought forward by Senator Dean, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, Senator Dean, for your openness to the conversations around this bill, as it is a consequential bill to the future of Canada. Colleagues, I encourage you to support this amendment. Thank you.